Behind every locked door lies a story the world was never meant to hear. Welcome to Behind Bars TV, where we uncover the hidden realities of the world's toughest prisons, untold inmate experiences, and the systems built to contain them. From Supermax facilities to forgotten penitentiaries, we revealed the truth behind concrete walls and razor wire. This is not fiction. This is the world behind bars. The most dangerous inmates in ADX Florence Supermax, Part 2. When silence fails. ADX Florence was built on one promise. No riots, no gangs, no control. And for the most part, it works. But there are men inside this prison who don't need crowds to be dangerous. Men who don't need orders to kill. Men whose minds are more lethal than weapons. This is not the story of how ADX Florence was built. This is the story of what happens when the most dangerous inmates on earth are locked alone with nothing but time, memory, and rage. In Part 1, we exposed who they are. In Part 2, we reveal what Supermax does to them, and what happens when the system begins to crack. Men too dangerous for death row. Some inmates at ADX Florence were never supposed to live this long. They committed crimes so severe, so calculated, so merciless, that many believed execution would be inevitable. But death row takes time, appeals, delays, legal battles, and until the system decides. These inmates must be held somewhere. ADX Florence became that place. What makes these men uniquely dangerous isn't just their crimes. It's that they have nothing left to lose. No parole hearings. No reputation to protect. No future to bargain for. Former officials say these inmates are the hardest to manage. You can't threaten a man who already accepted death. Inside Supermax, they are isolated not because they might escape, but because they might attack simply to feel something again. The silent predators. Not all dangerous inmates are loud. Some never raise their voices. Some never threaten guards. Some never break rules. These are the inmates staff fear the most. Former ADX guards call them the silent predators. They follow every rule, speak only when required, show no emotion, never ask for favors. On paper, they look compliant. In reality, they are watching everything, studying routines, tracking weaknesses, waiting for mistakes. One former correctional officer said, "If someone was yelling, I relaxed. If someone was quiet for years, I stayed alert." Supermax removes opportunity, but it cannot remove intent. And that intent simmers in silence. Time as a weapon. At ADX Florence, time is not neutral. It is weaponized. Days are identical. Weeks dissolve. Years erase milestones. No birthdays. No holidays. No markers of progress. Some inmates begin to lose the ability to track time, emotional reactions, motivation to speak. Others go the opposite direction. They sharpen themselves mentally. They replay crimes. They rehearse confrontations. They build entire worlds in their minds. Psychologists call this temporal distortion. Inmates call it going hollow. One former prisoner described it this way: "You don't feel alive. You feel paused indefinitely." ADX Florence doesn't rush punishment. It lets time do the work. When silence becomes a weapon. ADX Florence was designed to dominate through quiet. But some inmates learned to fight back without making a sound. They stopped speaking, stopped responding, stopped acknowledging commands beyond what was absolutely required. Not defiance, not violence, non-existence. Former staff described it as unsettling. It's easier to manage anger than absence. When someone stops reacting entirely, you don't know where they are mentally. This behavior forces the system into a dilemma. Force compliance and risk escalation. Ignore it and risk mental collapse. Supermax doesn't negotiate, but it does monitor relentlessly. Every breath, every movement, every pause. Inmates know this, and some use it to push the limits, without ever breaking a rule. Psychological warfare behind concrete. Supermax inmates quickly learn one truth. Physical power means nothing here. So they adapt. Some attempt to overwhelm staff psychologically, not with threats, but with consistency. They repeat the same phrases, ask the same questions, follow routines with unnatural precision. Psychologists call this cognitive pressure. The goal isn't to escape, it's to force reaction, to remind the system there's still a mind behind the door. Former clinicians say this is where Supermax becomes a chess match. The prison enforces routine. The inmate weaponizes predictability. No shouting, no violence, just endurance on both sides. The incidents they don't talk about. Officially, ADX Florence is calm. Unofficially, there have been moments when the system was tested. Lockdowns triggered without explanation. Medical teams deployed to isolation wings. Entire corridors sealed off for hours. Details are rarely released. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing can be allowed to happen here. Former staff describe these moments carefully. It's not chaos. It's controlled tension. Every response is calculated. Every movement documented. Every decision measured against one priority. Do not let control slip. Supermax isn't about stopping violence after it starts. It's about making sure it never starts at all. The long game, inmates. Some inmates arrive at ADX Florence angry. Others arrive strategic. These are the men who believe Supermax is a test, not a sentence. They read policy manuals obsessively. They memorize routines. They log every interaction. Their plan is simple: outlast the prison. They believe that if they follow rules perfectly, for years, sometimes decades, the system will eventually loosen its grip. Former administrators confirm this strategy does sometimes work. But there's a catch. Supermax does not reward effort. It rewards absolute consistency over time. One mistake, one emotional slip, one misinterpreted action, and years of progress disappear. For many long-game inmates, the hardest enemy isn't the prison. It's themselves. When hope becomes a liability, hope keeps people alive. But in Supermax, hope can also be dangerous. Inmates who fixate on transfer dates, step-down phases, or imagined release timelines often struggle the most. Why? Because ADX Florence doesn't operate on promises. It operates on risk assessment. When hope collides with delay, frustration builds. When frustration has nowhere to go, it turns inward. Psychologists report that many inmates begin to suppress hope entirely, not because they've given up, but because expectation hurts more than isolation. One former inmate said, "The day I stopped hoping was the day it got easier. That's when I knew something inside me had changed." Supermax doesn't just isolate bodies. It reshapes expectations of the future. The ice state, emotional shutdown. There is a mental state many Supermax veterans describe. They call it the ice. This is when emotions don't disappear, but freeze. Anger fades. Fear dulls. Joy becomes theoretical. Inmates in the ice state speak less, move slower, show no reaction to good or bad news. From the outside, they appear stable. From the inside, they are sealed off, even from themselves. Staff say these inmates are easier to manage, but harder to understand. One psychologist explained it bluntly. It's not healing, it's preservation. The ice state allows survival in Supermax, but it comes with a cost that often isn't visible until years later. When fear disappears. Fear is the foundation of every prison system. Fear of punishment, fear of loss, fear of consequences. But in ADX Florence, something strange happens to certain inmates. After years of isolation, fear doesn't grow. It evaporates. These inmates no longer react to disciplinary threats, loss of privileges, extended isolation, not because they are brave, but because they have already endured the worst the system can offer. Former staff describe this as the most dangerous psychological shift of all. You can't control someone who's not afraid of suffering. These inmates don't lash out. They don't rebel. They simply stop responding emotionally to authority. And that creates a new kind of risk. A person who does not fear punishment, may eventually test limits purely out of curiosity. The clinical experiment nobody planned. ADX Florence was never intended to be a psychological experiment. But over decades, it has become one. Mental health professionals monitor inmates for cognitive decline, emotional flattening, disassociation, identity erosion. Some changes are subtle, others are profound. Inmates begin speaking in shorter sentences. They stop referencing the outside world. They stop using when and start using if. Former clinicians admit there is no clear roadmap. There's no precedent for holding people in this level of isolation for decades. Supermax didn't just create new security standards. It forced psychology to confront uncharted human limits. And the results are still unfolding. Losing identity behind the door. In normal prisons, identity is reinforced. Gangs, nicknames, reputation, hierarchy. In Supermax, identity dissolves. There are no audiences, no rivals, no validation. Inmates are referred to by numbers. Interactions are brief. Personal expression is minimal. Over time, many inmates report a disturbing sensation. They no longer know who they are without conflict. One former prisoner said, "When no one sees you long enough, you stop seeing yourself." This loss of identity can lead to emotional collapse, complete withdrawal, or total emotional detachment. ADX Florence doesn't erase inmates physically. It erases context. And without context, the self begins to fade. The inmates who adapted too well. Not every inmate at ADX Florence deteriorates. Some become deficient. They follow every rule. They anticipate instructions. They never argue, never complain, never react. On paper, they are ideal prisoners. But veteran staff say these inmates are the most unsettling. Why? Because their calm isn't peace. It's detachment. These inmates no longer respond emotionally to good news, bad news, change. They operate like systems, predictable, controlled, contained. One former guard said, "They didn't feel human anymore. And that's what worried us." Supermax didn't defeat them. It reshaped them. When calm becomes a warning sign. In most prisons, aggression is the warning sign. In Supermax, it's calm. Mental health staff watch closely for inmates who stop expressing frustration, stop asking questions, stop reacting to setbacks. This can indicate emotional shutdown, not recovery. These inmates are not healed. They are sealed. Psychologists compare it to survival mode taken too far, where emotions are suppressed indefinitely to avoid pain. The danger? When emotion returns suddenly, it can return without moderation. Supermax minimizes opportunity, but no system can eliminate risk completely. The fear of release. For most prisoners, release is the goal. For some Supermax inmates, release is terrifying. After years, sometimes decades, of total control, freedom becomes overwhelming. Noise, people, choices. Inmates approaching step-down phases often experience anxiety spikes, sleep disruption, emotional instability. One former inmate said, "Supermax taught me how to survive alone. It didn't teach me how to exist around people." This creates a brutal paradox. The inmates who adapt best to Supermax may struggle the most outside it, when the system works too well. By every measurable security metric, ADX Florence is a success. There are no large-scale riots, no gang takeovers, no coordinated inmate violence. Compared to other high-security prisons, Supermax is quiet. Too quiet. Former administrators acknowledge a difficult truth. If your only goal is control, ADX Florence is nearly perfect. But prisons aren't only measured by what doesn't happen. They're measured by what happens to the people inside. At Supermax, danger is neutralized by removing social identity, emotional expression, human unpredictability. This creates a population that is compliant, but altered. The system doesn't collapse inmates. It reformats them. And once reformatted, There's no guarantee they can ever return to a normal social environment. The damage that can't be reversed. Some effects of Supermax isolation fade. Others don't. Mental health experts have identified long-term changes in inmates who spent years at ADX Florence. Chronic emotional numbness. Difficulty interpreting social cues. Heightened anxiety in open spaces. Impaired decision-making. These aren't temporary symptoms. They're structural changes in how the brain processes the world. One clinician described it this way: you can remove someone from isolation, but isolation doesn't always leave them. This creates an ethical paradox. ADX Florence may prevent violence inside prison, but it can leave inmates fundamentally altered outside of it. The question becomes unavoidable. Is permanent psychological damage an acceptable price for absolute security? A warning disguised as a solution. Around the world, prison systems studied ADX Florence. Some copied it. Some modified it. Some rejected it outright. What they all noticed was the same pattern. Short-term control improved. Long-term human outcomes worsened. Supermax became a warning wrapped in success. It showed what happens when society chooses containment over rehabilitation and silence over complexity. ADX Florence answers one question extremely well. How do we stop the worst people from hurting others? But it leaves another question unanswered. What do we become when this is the only answer we're willing to use? The men who will die in Supermax. There are inmates at ADX Florence who are not waiting for transfer. They are not in the step-down program. They are not under review. They are not preparing for anything. They are waiting to die. Some are serving multiple life sentences. Some are under permanent special administrative measures. Some are considered too dangerous to ever exist in another environment. For these men, Supermax is not punishment. It is permanent containment. They will age in the same cell. They will follow the same routine. They will watch years pass through the same narrow window. Former federal officials don't describe these inmates with emotion. They describe them with certainty. There are people who cannot be safely released ever. ADX Florence doesn't ask whether these men can be redeemed. It answers a different question. Can society afford to risk them again? And for some inmates, the answer is final. ADX Florence is a mirror. ADX Florence is often described as a prison for monsters. But prisons don't define monsters. Societies do. ADX Florence exists because the world decided there are crimes so severe, behaviors so dangerous, and minds so volatile that rehabilitation is no longer the goal. Only distance. Only silence. Only control. Supermax doesn't scream. It doesn't riot. It doesn't fail dramatically. It works quietly. And that's what makes it unsettling. Because ADX Florence doesn't just reveal who these inmates are. It reveals who we are when fear outweighs hope, when safety outweighs redemption, when containment outweighs compassion. ADX Florence is not about vengeance. It is about limits. The limits of control. The limits of rehabilitation. The limits of what society is willing to risk. And as long as those limits exist, so will Supermax, the guards who stayed. When people talk about ADX Florence, they talk about inmates. They rarely talk about the people who stay after the doors close. Correctional officers at Supermax don't see riots. They don't break up fights. They don't negotiate gang truces. Instead, they manage absence, silence, distance, routine. Former guards say the job follows them home. They become hyper-aware in public spaces, uncomfortable with crowds, irritated by noise. One former officer said, "You spend all day controlling danger by distance. Then you go home, and distance doesn't exist anymore." ADX Florence doesn't just shape inmates. It reshapes the people tasked with containing them. When a system has no exit, ADX Florence was never designed with an end date. It wasn't built to evolve. It wasn't built to transition. It was built to hold. As decades pass, a new problem emerges. What happens when a system designed for permanent containment becomes permanent? More inmates age. Medical needs increase. Mental deterioration compounds. The prison remains rigid. The population changes. Administrators quietly acknowledge the truth. You can't run a place like this forever without consequences. Supermax solved one problem extremely well, but it created another, a system with no graceful way to end. The inmates who outlived their danger. Some inmates sent to ADX Florence were once undeniably dangerous. But decades pass. Bodies weaken. Reflexes slow. Influence fades. This raises a question few want to ask. What happens when a man outlives the threat he once posed? Supermax risk assessments are conservative by design. The cost of being wrong is too high. So many inmates remain, not because they are still dangerous, but because certainty is impossible. ADX Florence becomes less about current risk and more about past certainty. The future of Supermax. ADX Florence is no longer the end of the line. Technology is changing containment. AI surveillance, behavioral prediction, biometric monitoring. Future prisons may not need total isolation to achieve total control. This raises an unsettling possibility. ADX Florence may one day be remembered not as the most extreme prison, but as the prototype, a first draft of something more subtle, more invisible, more permanent. The world is watching, not to dismantle Supermax, but to refine it. What remains when the doors close? When the last count is done? When the radios go quiet? When the lights dim? ADX Florence remains, not as a story of villains, not as a story of justice, but as a record of limits. The limits of punishment, the limits of rehabilitation, the limits of how far society is willing to go to feel safe. Long after the inmates are gone, long after the guards retire, the concrete will still be there, holding the silence. What you just saw is more than a story. It's a reality lived by thousands behind bars. If you believe in uncovering the truth, the kind hidden behind concrete walls and silence, then join us. Subscribe to Behind Bars TV and never miss a chapter in the world's most dangerous stories. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, subscribe, and stay locked in. Until next time, keep your mind open and your curiosity sharp. Remember, freedom and confinement are sometimes only a wall apart.